Hello, and welcome back for part 3 of this 5-part series on data binding. In part 2, we created our simple movie class and we bound an instance of a movie object to our UI. Here in part 3, we're going to take that same class and we're going to have it implement the iNotify property change interface. And implementing this interface, which we'll talk about more in a second, helps us to notify the UI of changes to our data and then vice versa. So the iNotify property change interface is used to notify clients, typically binding clients, that a property value has changed, which is exactly what we're looking for. So if we change any of the properties in our movie class, as long as it's implementing the iNotify property change interface, those changes will be propagated up to the UI. So this is how we start getting into the 4 different kinds of binding that we mentioned in the first introduction video. Right now we're just using the one-time binding, but to do any of the other 3 types, the two-way, one-way, or one-way to source, we're going to have to implement this interface. So let's move over back to our movie class, and to say that we're implementing this interface, just do a colon after the movie, and iNotify property changed, and I'm going to need to resolve that. There we go. And so there's just a few simple steps that we need to do to set this up properly. We need to now change the set methods or add to the set methods for each one of the properties so that it makes a call to a function, a method called notify property change. So I've got this copied over here. Let me copy and paste it in. So the call looks like that. This one we'll call rating. My quotes are a little off here. And then the third one will notify that we're changing the year, obviously. Change that to year real quick. So we don't have this. I'm getting a red error here because we don't have that method defined, and we'll do that in a second. The next thing we needed to do is add a property changed event handler. So we'll just declare that at the top of our page, and it looks like this. So public event property change event handler called property change. And now we're just going to go down and create our virtual notify property change method. Let me come down here. And what it says, if our property change event handler that we just created, if it's not null, go ahead and notify that and call that property change method with the property name that we passed it from above. So we're either passing title, rating, or year. So right now, if we were to run our application, it would basically run the exact same as the way it did in the end of part 2. And that's because even though we've set up this interface, we aren't dynamically changing any of our data. So to do that and test it to make sure we did this properly, I'm going to add a button in our stack panel, and I'm going to give it content to say update data, and I'm going to set the font size to 54 so we can see it, and close it. Oops. There we go. So now we've got a button on here. If we scroll down, it says update data, and if I double click, it should generate the event handler for the button. Give it a second, it's a little slow. It's generated the code down here in the XAML. Now I'm waiting for it. There it is to pop up in the code behind. And now when we click this button, I just want to change the data of our movie to something a little bit different. So I'm going to say movie.title. Just set that again, and I'm going to set it to Rio 2. I think is a kids movie that's out now. And then movie.rating is PG, I believe. And then I could change the year, but I think it came out in 2014 too, so that's actually going to be the same. So let's go ahead and run this now in the Windows Phone emulator since we've got it up, and give it a second to load. And we should see, okay, so our initial X-Men PG-13 2014 is correct, just like we had before. Now if we click the button, it changed the data and the underlying data source, and now those changes have been propagated up to our UI. Very cool. So I'm going to stop that. I could run that in Windows 8. It'll run the exact same. I'll just kind of skip that for now. So that deals with one-way binding, right? So if we update our data source, those changes are propagated to the UI. Now, let's say that we have some text blocks, and whatever they are bound two-way to our data source. So one text block for each of the different properties. There's one bound to title, one bound to rating, and one bound to year. And if we change the data in those, that data should then be changed in the underlying data source as well. So I'm going to change up our UI a little bit, and I've got it already created, so I'm going to copy it in here and talk about what I've done. Pull this back up. So we are going to have basically two columns defined here, and each column will have 4 rows. One row for title, one for rating, one for year, and then one for the click me button that's going to update our data still. On the left hand side, those 3 properties are going to be text blocks. On the right hand side, they're going to be text boxes, and they are all bound to the same data. So up here we have one text block for title and then one text box for title as well. And we're going to see an interesting chain of events when we change the data behind the scenes. So I'm going to actually switch over to my Windows 8 project now and run that, and I'll talk about what's going on once that pops up. Alright, so here we can see on the left side we have our text blocks, X-Men PG-13 2014. On the right side we have our text boxes, which are input from the user, so we can change these in a second. First I'm going to click this button, it says click me, and when I do that both sides are updated because they're bound to the same data source. Now let's take a look at what the two-way binding does if we change whatever is in this text box on the right. Sorry about that. So we'll change this from Rio 2 to draft day, and if I tab away from it, you see that that change is propagated to the left side as well. So what's happening is the text box, since it's two-way binding, when I change the data here, it reflects in the underlying data source, and since the left side is bound to the same data source, that change is propagated here as well. So I could change this to PG-13, tap away, and you see the changes come up over there. 1991, same thing. So it's a very cool example of the kind of chain of events that go through when you use the different kinds of data binding. So that concludes part 3. In part 4, we're going to actually bind to a collection of movie objects. So instead of just having one movie object displayed, we're going to display information about several movie objects. So stay tuned for part 4.